This is They Create Worlds, episode 245, The History of Commodore, part 2.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
We join you once again with the history of Commodore. This time, not the first time, but the second time. If you're here from, 20 minutes ago, hi. Welcome, Twitch chat. Welcome to our shared nightmare.
You make it sound so charming. Yes, that's right. We are here in part 2 of our look at Commodore International and its predecessor company, Commodore Business Machines of Canada. We are once again coming at you live from our Twitch channel, as we do only once a year because we would not survive if we did it more than that, to live stream the recording of this 3-part, possibly shifting into 4-part, look at Commodore International. In our first episode, we basically just went over the most shenaniganiest of corporate shenanigans as we discussed the backgrounds of both one Jack Tramiel and one Irving Gould, people who have more holding companies than I have pairs of socks, I do believe. Got ourselves to the point where these two men have met under forced circumstances in the aftermath of the Atlantic acceptance scandal and got back on their feet through the calculator and then got crushed in the calculator wars, forcing them to vertically integrate and go after a little chip company by the name of MOS Technology.
Obviously, they took MOS, made the Commodore PET, made the Commodore 64, made the Commodore 128, and these lovely monitors, the 1701 model, that I adored and played all my Nintendo games on for many, many years, and thus, we were happy. End of episode. On to episode 5.
You left out the +4, Jeffrey.
Aw, but no one cares about that one.
I'm told it's big and hungry.
Oh, well, okay then. Hungry? Have your Commodore +4.
Indeed. Yes, it is the 1702. It says it right there on your graphic and right there in the chat.
Yeah, that's assuming that I can read and or remember things. Because, I can't.
I just know everyone's favorite disk drive is the 1541, right?
I have that. I'm not sure if it works, but I have that.
I mean, I'm not so sure it worked when you first bought it, but that's another story.
Mm-hmm.
Just as a reminder for those of you that are listening to this as a normal podcast episode, since we are doing this in front of a live studio audience, we will be interacting with chat some. A lot of that gets edited out by editing Jeffrey, assuming he survives the process. But you may still get some random references to comments in chat and people in chat in this episode, unlike in a typical episode.
MOS Technology! It's been bought. People like corporate shenanigans. They did some very questionable money laundering. What's next on the trials and travails of Commodore?
Yes, we do need to take just a brief step back and talk a little bit about MOS Technology, because what Jack Tramiel thought he was doing was securing his place in the calculator business. That was his entire focus at this point. The calculator wars had left him greatly damaged, but he still felt there was a future in that market, and that was a market he understood. What he didn't quite understand is that he was buying a company that was already taking its first baby steps into a market that he did not understand, that being the market of the personal computer. The reason that this happened was due to an individual who had only recently joined the company by the name of Chuck Peddle. Chuck Peddle is really the person that's going to be defining a lot of the early history of Commodore in the computer business. He becomes one of those classic inner family members that we talked about in our last episode, where Jack Tramiel values certain trusted employees above all others. He will, at various times, betray that inner family trust, and they have a very contentious relationship. But in the midst of all of that, they do manage to somehow help launch a computer revolution together as well. Chuck Peddle was actually an old hand in the computer industry by the time Commodore bought MOS Technology. He graduated from the University of Maine and went to work in 1961 for General Electric in their computer division. This is really an important connection here because General Electric was not just any computer company. General Electric was one of the pioneers in the widespread adoption of time sharing due to the Dartmouth folks choosing a GE computer for use in the Dartmouth time sharing system, something that we talk about in our time sharing history episode. Chuck Peddle was very familiar with time sharing and did a lot of work on that at General Electric. He was also involved in electronic cash register designs there as well, and stayed with the company all the way until it exited the computer business in 1970, figuring out, as RCA did at around the same time, that there was not room for 7 dwarves to live in the shadow of IBM, and General Electric was a widely diversified company that could figure out other things to do with their time that would be far more profitable. After that, he ended up briefly doing a couple of startups, one that was doing work on cash registers, building on the work that he had done at General Electric, a second one that was doing work on a word processor. Neither of them ended up going anywhere, and then so in 1973, he ended up taking a job at Motorola, one of the larger semiconductor companies out there at this point, which was just in the process of finishing its first microprocessor, the 6800. Not to be confused with the 68,000, which we'll have much to say about later. This is their entry into the 8-bit processor market. Once that chip was done, he was not the creator of it, but he was involved in the later stages of designing it. He was an evangelist for the processor, going out, visiting companies and people and trying to convince them to use 6800 processors in their products here at really the dawn of the microprocessor industry. I mean, really only gotten started at the tail end of 1971. What he found is that a lot of companies were not happy with the price. It's a $300 chip, which was pretty standard, I think, in those early days. But the problem is they didn't want to do a computer based around it. They wanted to use it in other devices as a controller. They wanted something that they could buy cheaply and embed in all sorts of devices, something that obviously is the world we live in today. This led Peddle to realize that, you know what? I think that people would buy a cheap microprocessor if one were available for use in these other products. He brought this idea to Motorola about doing a low-cost version of the 6800. They were like, thank you, no. So Peddle decided that he would build his own low-cost 6800 with computer blackjack and digital hookers, or something like that.
Ask Bender.
Of course, this was the very early days of the semiconductor industry. In a later period of time, if somebody had an idea like that, they might be able to go to a fab company, a fabrication company, and work with them directly to do some kind of craziness. But in these days, you really had to go to an existing chip company if you wanted to make a chip. The startup would have been prohibitive for an individual like Peddle, who's not already quite wealthy. And it just so happened that he had worked at GE with a gentleman by the name of John Pavinin, who was the co-founder of a Pennsylvania chip company by the name of MOS Technology. That company had been founded in 1969. It was founded by Alan Bradley. This was a period of time when circuits were really becoming a big deal. A lot of popularization of that in the 60s through the intercontinental ballistic missile programs like the Minuteman at the Defense Department, as well as, of course, the Apollo program. Circuits were kind of in. There were a lot of low-cost electronics starting to come in from Japan using all kinds of chips. It was a time when the industry was very volatile, but was definitely growing. The company Allen Bradley, which is a manufacturing company, decided that they should have a subsidiary in this business, and so ended up establishing MOS with some of these computer people like Pavinin. MOS had a good run through a lot of the calculator wars as an independent seller to a lot of companies. They were starting to have some difficulty by the middle of the 1970s, though. At the time Petal joined, they were still very much hoping that the trajectory had no place to go but up, and so they were very happy to bring Petal on board and have him work on this low-cost chip. In August 1974, Petal and 7 members of his design team in Arizona, Motorola there, resigned and came to work at MOS Technology. They ended up creating, by June 1975, 2 versions to begin with. There'd be many more that followed. Of a chip, they created a socket-compatible chip with the same pin layout as the 6800, called the 6501. Then a chip with a brand new layout, the 6502. 6501 cost $20, the 6502 just $25 at a time when most people's microprocessors still cost way more than that. Clever little design. I'm not a technical person, so I'm not going to go into it too much, but basically it was a super efficient processor as well. So even though the default clock speed initially of that processor was relatively low, it could, in most cases, actually operate just as well as other chips that were twice as fast, like the Z80, just because it was so efficient at what it did. And that's all I'm going to do about that before I set off some kind of holy war amongst the old-timers between 6502 aficionados and Z80 aficionados. All of us will only lose if we get to that point. So once that chip was done, the rest of the world kind of didn't believe them that they actually had this thing. I'm sure Petal's being a little dramatic in his retelling, but basically nobody believed you could actually have a microprocessor at that price. So they actually went to the WestCon show, an engineering convention, advertised the chip there and gave them out for the low price of $25 for anyone who wanted them. This would be 6502s. The 6501 disappeared very quickly because Motorola was like, oh, you used our pin layout? Well, that's violating our patents or trademarks or something or another. So sued them over it, and they decided eventually to drop it. But they brought the 6502 to WestCon, handed them out, and this got them some very high-profile early adoption, most notably from Atari for their video computer system that they had under development. Meanwhile, Chuck Petal also wanted to create a development system that people could use to play around with the chip, debug the chip, do simple programs on the chip, etc. So they created just a really, really tiny, barely qualifies as a computer called the Terminal Interface Monitor, or TIM. Some call it TIM?
Quite possibly. Tim the computer.
Yes. For this purpose. One of the co-founders of MOS, Don McLaughlin, didn't think that the TIM was actually friendly enough as a development system, so said that they should go back and create a second, slightly more user-friendly design. So they went back to the drawing board and made a development system called the Keypad Interface Machine, or KIM-1. So they created this KIM-1 as a second, slightly more robust development system that was complete with a calculator-style keypad and an LED, like a little one-line LED readout. So you could have a little bit more idea of what you were doing. Then a funny thing happened when they put out the KIM-1. It turned out people were so kind of desperate for a cheap computer that was essentially ready to go right out of the box that this KIM-1 sold thousands upon thousands of units, and not all of them, in fact, probably the majority of them, were not as a development system, but were because people just really wanted to play around with a computer and didn't necessarily want to mess with all of that soldering of components and finding cases and power supplies that most of the computers on the market at the time made you do, and often for a much higher price. And this got Petal to thinking that maybe we should do a real computer. Something that is actually meant for general public consumption, that we keep as low cost as we possibly can, but is actually useful and is ready to use right out of the box by anyone that wants to use it without having to assemble like the hobbyist kits that, as we said, were so prevalent at the time. We talk about a lot of that overview of what the computer industry, personal home computer industry looked like at that time in our Home Computer Price Wars episode. Well, it's a 3-parter, and we get to the price wars in episode 3. So we're getting to Commodore computers in episode 2 of this one. We're doing better. We're doing better, even though this is going to be like 10 episodes long.
Job security or, I don't know, something?
Indeed. Moss Technology thought this was a great idea and gave him the green light to start doing this at first. But then the full effect of the calculator wars were felt, and that support was withdrawn by management. They just simply didn't have the money to go through with that. At the same time, Allen Bradley, the parent company, had become completely fed up by this whole situation with the calculator wars and the losses, and decided that it was a mistake to get into the chip business and decided they wanted out of the chip business. However, rather than just liquidating the company, they gave an opportunity for the partners to buy it back, which they did. So the company continued to exist, but it was in a very precarious state, which is when Commodore entered the picture and wanted a chip company and completed that purchase in September of 1976. At this point, Peddle was basically out of the company. He was ready to leave. I mean, he was still at the company, but he was all set to go out on his own, strike out again, because he really felt strongly about his computer project. Once they were owned by Commodore, he was able to interest the engineering people in Commodore in what he was doing and got a meeting with Tramiel. Tramiel decided to go with it. According to Bagnall's book, he interviewed Peddle quite a bit. Yes, ready to leave for Allied Leisures, as our good friend Play History says, because it's a tangent. But Chuck Peddle was actually very, very involved with some of the earliest efforts to get microprocessors into pinball machines, partnering with Allied Leisure on developing a microprocessor system around the 6502, which is where he also met Bill Seiler, who would become quite the important engineer in the Commodore story later on as well. Yeah, that'd be cool if you get a hold of Bill Seiler. He's interviewed very thoroughly on Commodore. He's interviewed a little bit on Allied Leisure, but I know there's a lot more that you could pick at the Allied Leisure story from Bill Seiler. Maybe we'll learn that he's the one who started the fire.
No, you can't. It was always burning since the world's been turning.
Indeed. For those who don't know what that's all about, we did an Allied Leisure episode. You can listen to it and you can find out. So according to Peddle in his interviews in the Bagnall book, they really approached it with Jack as a next evolution of the calculator market, because Tramiel was very wedded to that market. He was a hardware guy and he was a calculator guy. All the interviews from Commodore at this time kind of talk about him as very set in his ways by this point. He couldn't have always been, because he moved from typewriters to adding machines to electronic desktop calculators to electronic calculators to digital watches. He moved through a lot of markets in the early days, but it seems like the computer market was a bridge too far. I mean, at this point, he's older. He's in his 60s. He's seen a few things out in the world, as we talked about in all our corporate shenanigans last time. And so he may have been getting a bit more conservative at this point. He knew what he knew, and he kind of wanted to stick with what he knew. So they sold this as kind of being the next step beyond the HP 65 programmable calculator. Yeah, you're right. He was in his 50s. I can math. No, I meant Jack. I just can't math. He was in his 50s. But thanks as always, Ethan Johnson, friend of the show, keeping things honest. So they had pitched as kind of the next evolution beyond the HP 65 programmable calculator from Hewlett-Packard, which was already able to accept different ROM chips for different functions and was a little more programmable in that sense. Tramiel kind of really appreciated this project, liked it, and thought that was a good idea, and gave Peddle the green light. You know, the interesting thing about the PET as compared to the other entries into the so-called Trinity, the TRS-80 and the Apple II, is that from the beginning, Peddle was thinking of this from the point of view of the Dartmouth time-sharing system that he had been part of working on the GE side back in the 60s. So he was really thinking, even though this was going to be a self-contained computer, it was not going to be a terminal. his idea of a computer that the average person would want to use was something similar to the setup of the Dartmouth time-sharing system, which is that you have a character-based CRT display. You have BASIC in ROM, so that you can use BASIC to do some things. You have the keyboard and the monitor as part of one kind of integrated case, very similar to a terminal. Interestingly enough, according to Peddle, they were initially, so that they didn't have to do this whole thing in-house, they were going to buy a little upstart company by the name of Apple Computer and use their technology as a starting point to get this whole thing done. Alas, they couldn't come to terms, and so history took a very different direction.
Do we blame Steve Jobs or do we blame Steve Wozniak?
I don't know that blame's the right word. I don't know how well that would have really worked. Can you imagine either of the Steves working for Jack Tramiel? Because I can't.
It wouldn't last long. One or the other is going to end up somewhere not nice. Possibly where the mafia is taking you later today.
Yeah, that's right. Or the Saudis. I'm pissing off all of the shadowy folks these days. It seems like all in one episode. So he puts together this computer with the help of another engineer, Peter Senhall. Together they design this thing. It's pretty basic, pun I guess intended, but it is a complete computer. It has a built-in keypad that is almost a keyboard. It has a built-in cassette drive. It has a built-in monitor. It's all part of one metal case that is created by another Commodore subsidiary. Very simple display, but it can do 40 columns, I think, from the beginning, which is not too bad. Text only, so, it can't do, like, big fancy graphics. It's run by that MOS technology chip, and they go ahead and advertise it initially with a 4K configuration and an 8K configuration. The big thing is that they initially advertise it for $4.95. This is the initial. It doesn't come out there. But they advertise it all for $4.95, which is a ridiculously low price for a computer with a monitor and a keyboard built into it. They have to raise it eventually, but even as they raise it, it only goes up to $5.95 for the 4K model and $7.95 for the 8K model. Turns out that the 4K model is completely useless, so they quietly retire that one. But even at $7.95, that's a pretty good price for something that includes both a keyboard, which I could put in air quotes for the chat here, and a cassette drive and a monitor. I mean, it's not a bad price at all for that kind of thing. The way they're able to do this is they do have a couple of instances of vertical integration here. Of course, they're using the MOS technology chip, so they're able to buy the processor at cost. There's that vertical integration. I think the very first version also used MOS's RAM, but MOS technology wasn't very good at RAM. So that was more of a hindrance than anything. MOS technology was only capable of working in static RAM, which is very slow. I assume they used their own SRAM. I could be wrong. MOS technology had tried to get into the RAM business. It was a disaster. They had no idea what they were doing. The Japanese pretty quickly locked up the entire RAM business. So they had some vertical integration with that. They also had some vertical integration with the keyboard, which was really more of two calculator keypads kind of stuck together. Because Commodore was in the calculator business, they had already designed a calculator keypad. So they were like, throw a couple of those things in there and call it good. It was cheap, and it was terrible to use, but it was cheap. And the other thing they did is the case was actually a metal case that was created by another subsidiary of the company up in Canada that was a metal working company. Nortex Products. A fun fact, Commodore had a couple. Now, way back in the day, they had done office furniture. I don't know what happened there. I think they had long since gotten rid of their office furniture company. But Nortex Products was a company that did metal housewares like cabinets and tables and counters and stuff out of metal. Until 1976, Nortex Products was actually a subsidiary of SuperPac, the laundry products vending machine company that was financed by Irving Gould and for which Irving Gould was the chairman. They had a couple of metal products companies, Nortex and one called Gilman Industries. In 1976, SuperPac sold those metal products companies to Commodore International. Gould, of course, being the chairman of both of them. The reason that the Commodore PET has a metal case and that the Commodore had a company to make that metal case was because of more corporate shenanigans by one Mr. Irving Gould. But this all combined to make the computer relatively cheap. They were also very lucky, as pointed out to me and corrected to me by Dale, that they did not have to meet any FCC requirements, which meant that they didn't have to pack in a bunch of additional shielding.
How'd they manage that?
Well, we've talked about the FCC many times on here, most notably in our home computer price wars episode. As Dale helpfully pointed out, those FCC standards that everyone was flailing trying to meet, like Apple and Atari and Fairchild and RCA and all of the home computer and video game companies, those actually only applied when you were actually going to be broadcasting a signal to something outside of your self-contained unit. Yes, can't forget Tandy, which at one point tried to get a transmitter's license for one of their computers to be like, you see, this is fine. Our computer's a licensed transmitter. I think that was for the color computer. No, it wasn't the color computer. It was another computer they were doing at the same time as the Coco, where they were like, no, it's okay that we have all of this leakage. We're a licensed transmitter. You know, A for creativity on that one. But it only applied when you were sending a signal out to an external source, an external monitor that you were plugging into. And since the PETS monitor was included, was part of the whole thing, they didn't actually have to get that same type approval. Of course, they also did have a metal case, which probably helped a little bit as well, because in a way, the thing was a giant shield, but that wouldn't have been enough on its own, because you still need better shielding than a metal case if you're actually going to get that type approval, but they didn't need to get the type approval. So they didn't have to pack the thing full of shielding. They had vertical integration in chips, vertical integration in the case, vertical integration in the keyboard or keypad.
I can only imagine if Nintendo decided to go, you know, just to get around these FCC regulations, we're going to slap a monitor on the NES.
Right. SM Oliva is saying that he seems to recall there were some FCC issues with the Osborne 1, the portable computer. We'll have to let Quarter Past and SM Oliva duke that one out in the chat, because I am not an FCC expert. The Commodore engineers, now these Commodore engineers were not the engineers that built the PET, but later Commodore engineers said that they thought that they had not run into any trouble on the PET because they had a metal case, and that just served as the shielding. Dale, our resident FCC expert, and he truly is, there's no sarcasm in that, indicates that they didn't need as strict a type approval. Now, Dale's with us in the chat, so I'll ask Dale, was there still some kind of standard that they had to meet, even though they didn't have to meet those super stringent type approval standards? And did the metal case help with that? I'm getting a yes. That may be part of it. I guess it's a two-pronged thing. The standards were lower because it was built in, but not completely non-existent. And then probably having the metal case didn't hurt, because that's going to absorb something or another. So they were able to offer this thing at a pretty reasonable price, all things considered. They just had one problem, though, and it was the same problem that they faced when they were buying MOS technology, which is they still had no money.
Money.
Commodore was on the verge of bankruptcy. Commodore was a publicly traded company, so they could theoretically issue shares in the company to try to raise some capital to do things like set up manufacturing for the PET computer. The problem is that Irving Gould, who was in control of the company, we talked about him in the last episode, he owned about roughly 18% of the stock, which made him the largest single shareholder. He was also the chairman. He had packed the board with his finance buddies up in Canada, and so was pretty much in control of anything and everything that mattered. did not want to dilute his stock position by selling shares when the stock was trading just above junk status. Irving Gould had a very lavish lifestyle. He split his time between Toronto, New York, and the Bahamas on a schedule that was designed to avoid paying income tax anywhere. He relied on his investments in all of these companies to maintain that lifestyle. Gould's entire goal with any company that he was financing was to have as much stock as possible and pump up the price of that stock as much as possible. He wasn't willing to dilute ownership in the company or sell stock at a time when the stock was very low, near junk status. So he refused to allow Jack to raise money in the markets to be able to fund something like manufacturing a computer. It was a complicated relationship that those two had, which is worth bringing up a little bit right now. Gould was an active participant in the company. He didn't involve himself in the day-to-day of the company, not at this point, but he was invested in its success, both figuratively and literally. He did have an office in New York. That was one of the places that he spent some of his time, in the Seagram building. He did meet with analysts and do presentations and handle kind of the investor relations and analyst relations side of the business in an attempt to pump the stock up. He kept a very tight leash on Jack, but I think he also sensed that Jack was somebody who was good at working in adverse conditions. Jack was a hustler. He had to be. He literally had to be. The only reason Jack Tramiel was still alive at roughly the age of 50, I can sometimes math, is because he was such a hustler in the ghetto, in the camps, in post-war Europe, in 1950s America. I think Gould had confidence that Tramiel would be able to overcome obstacles. Because he had that confidence, he wasn't going to squander resources by selling low. I'm sure that at times this frustrated Jack Tramiel. Jack Tramiel must have absolutely chafed at having so much of his destiny controlled by someone who was not him and who was not part of his inner family. Spoiler alert, that chafing is going to be basically what ultimately ends with him departing the company. So it's a great point of tension between them. But on the other hand, Irving Gould was also right about Jack Tramiel. He was good in adversity. He was a hustler. He was good at figuring things out. He did come out of Atlantic Acceptance, I think, older and wiser. He is keeping a tight leash on the company himself as well. He's not building layers of middle management. He's not letting people spend money that he doesn't know about. It leads to a lot of real misunderstandings about Jack. It's very interesting. The most interesting thing about Brian Bagnall's book is one of the most successful people ever at navigating Jack Tramiel, I think it's fair to say, was the UK marketer, later general manager, later does stuff in America. We'll talk about him more later, Kit Spencer, who always seems to have a different take on Jack than everyone else, but always seems to have more success with him as well. Jack Tramiel penny pinched like crazy and would get on you for spending money he didn't think you needed to spend. But if you could show him that you were spending money to make money, that you were doing an investment and turning something into a profit center, he'd usually leave you alone. That was something that Kit Spencer had great success in doing. He was a hustler, he was a penny pincher, but he also recognized opportunity and taking risks for opportunity. I think that's probably what Irving Gould recognized in him and wanted to cultivate, but he did it by keeping him, as he once famously said in an article in Forbes entitled Albatross in 1983, kept him on a very tight leash. That's all a tangent. Who knew we'd do one of those here?
I didn't.
Nobody expects an Alex tangent. Our chief weapon is surprise. That's all to say, though, that at this period of time, Gould was not going to give him money, but they needed money, or they weren't going to be able to manufacture this computer that had the potential to save the company, or at least put the company on a better financial footing. they show the computer at a few early trade shows, one in Germany where Commodore is very strong, where the brand is very strong, the Hanover Fair. They showed at the West Coast Computer Fair, and then they showed at CES, the June CES, in 1977, which is when all this is going down. The thing that Tramiel notes at CES and at these other shows is that there were a lot of people that were just kind of like, shut up and take my money. People were really excited, not just like people on the street, but like dealers as well. Distributors were really excited about this idea of a computer that was pre-assembled and fairly reasonably priced, even at $795 for an 8K version. They were just dropping orders right there at CES. It's like, I'll take 100 of them, or I'll take 50 of them, or whatever. And we're handing him money to reserve their spot in line, handing him checks to reserve their spot in line. And so what he realized is, we can actually do a pre-order program, which is not normally how this kind of retailing is done. Normally it's done on terms, which means you sign a contract and they don't have to pay till 30, 60, 90, 120, however many days later in your terms. But people were willing to give him money up front, and so they started a pre-order system where if you sent a check for $795 to Commodore, that you would get a guaranteed delivery within 90 days. They did not hit that, but nobody asked for their money back either, because everyone was so excited about this idea of a more useful computer that was fairly reasonably priced that they were willing to put up with that. So they were able to get these things. They were able to get an assembly line in place and start manufacturing them by September of 1977. You know, they did okay. They only sold I think 5,000 or some odd the first year because they were just ramping up. But there was a decent amount of demand for them, particularly in Europe. And there were a couple of things going on in Europe that made this particularly work. First of all, the European market, and I don't have huge understanding of this, but the European market had developed in a kind of different way than the American computer market. Of course, most of the computers coming to Europe were coming from America. Most of the big computers were coming from America, from IBM. There were domestic computer companies like Olivetti, but IBM had taken over a lot of that market. But then the American mini computer companies and time-sharing companies didn't really penetrate Europe in the same way as they did in the United States. So there'd grown up in the 1960s a kind of mid-range computer category that was very peculiar to Europe, which were called office machines or office computers, which were kind of these desk-sized computers that were used for very specific data processing purposes. A little similar to mini computers in the United States, but not the same thing. This was entirely a cottage industry, particularly in West Germany, where these kinds of computers particularly flourished. In the European market, there was already this idea of having a smaller computer that you were using for business purposes. I'm positive because both in the UK and West Germany, which were the two strongest European markets that Commodore had, both of these markets very quickly alighted on the PET computer as a business machine. I don't think that happened in the same way in the United States. Now, of the trinity of the Apple II, TRS-80, and PET, the PET was definitely seen as the most business-like of those computers until a thing called VisiCalc came out. I don't think anyone was really seeing a microcomputer as a true legitimate business machine in the United States before VisiCalc came out. I mean, yeah, there were CPM machines, there was a little stuff going on, but that doesn't feel like the main thrust. I think Europe was a little more open to that kind of thing because of these so-called office computers or office machines. Both Kit Spencer in the United Kingdom and the GM of Commodore Germany, Harold Speyer, very quickly understood two things. First of all, they saw that they were going to have a demand that outstripped supply. Second of all, the combination of the strong Commodore brand name, which was already a gold standard brand name in offices because of their calculators and whatnot, and I think also because of this office machine market, was going to be quickly perceived as a high-quality business machine. With this combination of factors, both the UK and German branches actually raised the price. Because it turns out Commodore could have gotten away with a whole lot more. They probably could have gotten away with pricing it higher in the United States as well. But they were kind of feeling things out as they went. This is not computers for the masses, not the classes, Jack. That Jack doesn't exist yet. This Jack would have definitely milked the market for all that he could have gotten out of the market. But they were kind of feeling their way along. So in Germany and the UK, they actually raise the price to the equivalent of $1,295. Obviously, it's in pounds and Deutschmarks and whatever else, but essentially to $1,295. The other thing that the European general managers, who had a lot more freedom to do their own thing separate from Jack, and who often had better cash flow situations than Commodore did in the US because the brands were a little stronger. The other thing that they did, in addition to raising the price, is they also made sure that they had great aftermarket service and support. Jack Tramiel was a hardware guy, going way back. He sold hardware that, for the most part, was relatively simple to understand how to use. Typewriters, calculators. Some of the programmable or scientific stuff in calculators may get a little more complicated, but in general, these are products that are relatively straightforward to use. They were not products that used software. There was a little bit of programming in some of the more advanced calculators, but none of this was really software. Jack Tramiel never understood aftermarket service support and software support. He was a fire and forget kind of guy. I import this adding machine for $10, I sell it for $15. Buy for a nickel, sell for a dime. Fire and forget. Move on to the next hardware when the next hardware comes out. Always be innovative, always be pushing forward, but don't think about what you're putting out. Fire and forget. Kit Spencer in the UK, and I presume as well Harold Speyer in Germany, understood that this computer market was going to be very different. So what Kit Spencer did, even though he raised the price, is he also made sure there was a manual for it. Like the US office was supposed to write a manual, and eventually they did, but they were slow on it. Kit Spencer was like, no, I need to have a manual. So he got a manual together. He started a magazine so that there'd be something to garner additional interest and promotion. He was very careful in setting up his dealer network, and he also set up service support and made sure to corral software that Commodore could market with the computer. So as a result, even though the price was so high, people still flocked to the thing. According to Spencer, in that first year, it was not released until 78 in Europe. It came out in 77 in the US. They took 80% of the UK market and sold 30,000 machines. In both the UK and Germany, they established themselves as the gold standard in business computers. Something that they would hang on to for years and years and years. Even after they were finally eclipsed at some point in the 80s or early 90s by IBM, they were still the second largest computer company in these markets to IBM. It all started right here with this purposeful move into this market. And I think aided by this whole office machine thing, though I don't have complete 100% proof of that. Of course, this also means that we're already starting right here, something that will be the case throughout the entire run of Commodore's computer business, which is they never have the same success in the United States as they do abroad. Maybe very, very briefly in the VIC-20 C64 days. But outside of that one specific period, they never have the same success in the United States as they do in Europe. When we're talking Europe, we are particularly talking about the United Kingdom and West Germany, though they were in other European markets as well. The Commodore PET very kind of quickly establishes itself as the business machine of the original Trinity. The TRS-80 is definitely seen as more of a home thing. The Apple II is really, quite frankly, seen as more of a hobbyist machine. It's not a hobbyist machine anymore because you have to assemble it like the old ones, but a hobbyist machine because it's expensive and it's really more of a plaything than it is something of serious value until VisiCalc comes out. Once the Apple goes up to 48K and has VisiCalc, it's a different story, but we're not there yet. Commodore kind of is naturally drawn into this business market going forward. This is kind of the entire focus of the company in computers for the next couple of years. Now, they've always been in office equipment. It was a natural progression even there. So they start extending the PET very quickly in ways that are meant to enhance its capabilities as a business machine, particularly in those European markets. The first revision that they do is in 1979, when they do the PET 2001N for new. I really should say, because we never talked about it, the reason that they called it the PET is because they wanted something friendly, something approachable as a name. They thought of the pet rock, which was a big fad at the time, and called it the PET because of that, so that they wouldn't be sued. I don't know that you can be sued over a hunk of rock in a box, but whatever. Probably not really caring about being sued, but to make it seem like it was more than they said, they turned it into an acronym, I guess, and called it the Personal Electronic Transactor. But PET came first. That was just justification after the fact. Then they added 2001 on the end because of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which seemed so futuristic still because Star Wars was only just starting to change things. So yeah, Personal Electronic Transactor. And then 2001, because 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was still kind of the state of the art in what the future looks like, because Star Wars is only just starting to have a huge impact and change everyone's ideas. So then they, in 1979, did the 2001 N in for new in 8, 16, or 32K configurations in memory. Most important things here is that they stopped using the junky Commodore 6550 RAM chips, that static RAM that was too slow, and went for DRAM, which is faster and better. They also put in a proper full-sized keyboard, real keyboard. To make room for that, they did get rid of the built-in cassette player. Obviously, you could still get a cassette drive for it, but they got rid of the built-in so that they could do a real proper keyboard. This kind of cemented its place in that business community in Europe, most especially. It also led to Jack Tramel's extreme dislike of slots, which will come back at times in the future, because it turned out that a lot of people started buying the cheaper 8 or 16K computers and then buying memory expansions to get it up to 32K, which was costing the company money. Which is why when they released the 3000 series of the PET, they actually drilled holes through the spot where you would put memory expansions in the cheaper computers so that you couldn't do that anymore and had to buy. One final thing is it ended up that the PET was trademarked. The term PET was trademarked, I think, by Philips in Europe. So they started calling them CBM computers in Europe for Commodore business machines. And it didn't hurt that it was very similar to International Business Machines, that little company called IBM. They continued to extend it over the next few years, a couple of more times, even as it was getting longer in the tooth. The most important thing that they did is finally released a version called the 8000 on around 1980, but they actually release an 80-column version of it, the 8000 series, that allows you to do text in 80 columns, which was the gold standard in business machines. So they really pushed this thing between 1977 and about 1982 when they got away from it. And then they brought it back a little later because they were having trouble. This really became their gold standard business machine, and this was the direction that they really expected the company to continue to go. They actually started work after this on trying to create an Apple killer. This is another thing that is a hallmark of Jack Tramiel. We talked about this some on our Home Computer Price Wars episode, but there's nothing that Jack Tramiel loved more than seeing what was out there, seeing what the competition was doing, and then going back to his engineers and saying, I want one of those, except better and cheaper. Oh, there's X trade show coming up in a month. If you could have the prototypes ready by then, that'd be great.
So he worked them really hard, had unrealistic expectations, And he still got something that worked?
He did get things out of them. It tended to burn people out, which really affected the company long term. Like, all the people that worked on the 6502 were basically gone not too long after Commodore bought the company. There would be a continual brain drain at the company, particularly in their chip business, particularly at MOS, which would cause them to become more and more ineffectual at getting projects done and getting chips done, because they could not retain skilled chip engineers, which were in high demand based on that kind of crazy workload. They would churn through systems engineers and whatnot as well, perhaps at a slightly slower pace, but still, it was hard. It was hard to work for Jack. On the flip side, though, it did keep the company always pushing forward. They never rested on their laurels. They were always chasing the next product. The tech field is very much an innovate-or-die kind of field. That vitality that Jack brought to the business is probably a big part of why the business was so successful in the early days as well. There's kind of a malaise at Commodore after Jack leaves, because they didn't have somebody with that drive. Irving Gould was continually trying to find someone with that same drive and failing. Now, not everyone who came afterwards was absolutely wretched, though many of them were. But he kept trying to find that spark again, because he remembered that that's when the company was most successful as well. It was bad for the people, and it was bad for the long-term health of the company. But in this short term, in this brief period between 1977 and 1984, it kind of drove them to always be innovating in a way that really helped them stay near the top of the markets. There's good and bad, as there is with just about everything that comes along with Jack Tramiel. Jack Tramiel is also like, that Apple II has sure started to take some market share because it has VisiCalc. I mean, VisiCalc was also made available on the PET. And in fact, in some ways, once the 80-column PET came out, it was better for VisiCalc than the Apple II was, because it was 80 columns instead of 40 columns. But he's like, they have these graphics and they have VisiCalc. We need an Apple killer. We need something that captures some of that graphical capability of the Apple II while still maintaining our place in the business market. So that's what he exhorted his engineers to start creating. They started this project in 1979 under the name TOI, spelled T-O-I. Once again, this was a name that was chosen first. The letters were chosen first, and then they put an acronym behind it. So it was chosen because it felt like kind of a friendly name. Toys are friendly. And a vaguely Japanese name with that OI. Everything Japanese was in vogue, particularly in electronics at this time. Then they came up with the name The Other Intellect. Now, in order to compete with the Apple II graphically, they were going to need to have some kind of video chip that could do 40 columns, because the Apple could do 40 columns. Could do 80 columns with board expansions, but natively it did 40 columns. It just so happened that Commodore did have a graphics chip at this point, called the VIC chip, or video interface chip. So really called the VIC. It's not called the VIC chip. That's like saying PIN number or ATM machine. So they had a graphical chip called the VIC, video interface chip, with the official part number 6560 for the NTSC, 6561 for the PAL version. This chip had actually been started by one of the younger chip designers at MOS Technology back in 1977, Al Charpentier, I suppose he pronounces his name. I want to pronounce it Charpentier. I know Dale knows what I'm talking about. I suppose that since he's American, he probably pronounced it Charpentier or something like that. Al Charpentier was a young guy. He was hired by MOS just out of college. I mean, he had been an electrical engineering major, but really apprenticed with the more experienced MOS guys to really learn chip design. As we mentioned, back in 1975, the Atari folks, or rather the Cian Engineering folks at the time, there was a R&D subsidiary of Atari, decided to use the 6507, a more limited version, more pen-limited version of the 6502 in the Atari VCS. So as a result of that, Moss had a very lucrative business with Atari because they were supplying those 6507s for the VCS. They also supplied a lot of the ROMs that Atari was using in their cartridges. So they had a close relationship, and they saw kind of what Atari was doing with that system. Charpentier was very disappointed in the graphics on that system. He thought that the TIA chip, television interface adapter, with its one scan line at a time stuff, was just not very impressive. I mean, in some ways it wasn't. I mean, it was impressive even to design a chip, but of course they were going for as cheap as they could possibly get, and the limitations of the graphic chip were really about keeping it cheap. But he thought he could do better and create a much better chip for other companies that might want to enter the video game industry. So he actually created this VIC in 1977. The problem with VIC, which they were never able to find any takers of, so it was just sitting around. The problem with VIC from the perspective of using it in a computer, like the toy, is that it was only 20 columns. Actually, 22 columns, but basically just 20 columns. You could not use that in an Apple killer. You needed the 40.
At the very least, if not more, preferably 80.
Charpentier. Okay. Al Charpentier. Char, that makes more sense. Charpentier. Most Apples were used for playing games and running VisiCalc. But no, you're right. Obviously, all of these home computers and personal computers, which we talk about in our Home Computer Price Wars episode, were really game machines, and everything else that they happen to be able to do was an added bonus. As they're making the toy computer, they have this VIC chip, but the VIC was designed for video game systems, so it was only 22 columns and they needed 40 columns. To try to get the toy together quickly, because as always, Jack Tramiel wants something quickly. He wants something to show at the January 1980 CES, only giving them a small amount of time to do this. They try to kind of kludge together a VIC chip that does 40 columns and color, because the original VIC didn't do color either. They had a separate color chip that they created. Natively, the original VIC didn't do color. So they kind of squished two VICs together in a way to create a 40-column display, but they ran into the same problem again that they ran into on the PET in terms of RAM. To do 40 columns, they needed faster RAM to be able to load all of that reasonably. They were still tied to SRAM primarily. The toy was going to be using SRAM. Static RAM was just not fast enough to do this. They try this kludge stuff for the toy, and it just doesn't work. They do show a prototype at the January CES, but of course, prototypes, you can do all sorts of smoke and mirrors to make it seem like something's working when it's really not. In point of fact, it is really not working. This is becoming more and more of a problem. But they need this computer because Jack Tramiel is saying we need to go high-end, we need to go higher and higher. We are making business computers. That is what we do. Chuck Peddle, who had briefly left the company in 1978 to join Apple and then decided he hated it there and came back to Commodore, is really pushing his engineers in California to get this toy done, to get a 40-column Apple killer done, to move further and further into the business market. That's where the situation stands in April 1980, when Jack has one of his periodic worldwide meetings of all the worldwide managers and managing directors in London. We talked about this in our Home Computer Price Wars episode, so this is a little bit of a retread, but it's important in the Commodore context here, so we have to talk about it again here as well. They have the first day of meetings, and then Jack goes out to kind of see what the state of things is in the UK firsthand. He discovers that his old nemesis in calculators, Uncle Clive Sinclair, has released a ridiculously cheap computer, the ZX80, and it is selling well, despite the fact that this thing is super duper limited. As we've talked about before, it shipped with 1 kilobyte of memory, which meant that whenever you typed, as we talked about in our Home Computer Price Wars episodes, whenever you typed a character, the screen temporarily blanked because there was enough memory to type a character and there was enough memory to update the display there was not enough memory to do both at the same time. Now, yes, you could upgrade it to a maximum of 16K, but a lot of people that are buying this are not upgrading it. They're just using the base model. Despite all of that, it is selling like hotcakes. This is like a bolt from the blue for Jack Tramiel. This is the moment that he realizes maybe going bigger and better and getting more enmeshed in the business market and high quality graphics and all of this, maybe that's not the way to go. Maybe we build a super cheap computer and sell it to ordinary folks at a cheap price, and they will buy this thing. And as an added bonus, he's been scared of the Japanese, as everyone who works in any industry at this time in the United States is. He's been scared to death of the Japanese coming in and undercutting. This may actually be an avenue to prevent the Japanese from taking over this home computer market in the same way that they took over cars and televisions and steel and all of these other industries going back decades. That's right. MSX is coming. Doesn't officially exist yet at this point, but just in terms of foreshadowing of the story, MSX is coming. So he comes into day 2 of the meeting and he shows up late. Peddle and some of the other people had kind of convened the meeting in his absence because he wasn't there, and they were talking about plans for the toy, for the Apple Killer, for moving up the chain into more sophisticated business machines. Tramiel comes in and gives that famous, "The Japanese are coming, so we will become the Japanese." And he tells them, this is what we need. Chuck Peddle is having none of this. This part of it we didn't talk about in the home computer price wars because we weren't focused on Commodore, we were focused on the wider industry. Chuck Peddle is having none of this. He's like, that is ridiculous. The future of the business is higher quality, serious business machines. He's right in the grand scheme of things. We are all using some form of IBM PC compatible right now. Probably. I don't know. One of you in chat might have a Mac. But Jeffrey and I, the official podcast, we are using some form of IBM PC compatible hardware.
Give or take, yes.
So in one sense, Chuck Peddle is correct. That's the way the market, long term, is going to go. It's not necessarily Commodore that's going to be leading that charge. It's hard to believe that Commodore could have actually stood before IBM and their PC and, outdid them. As SM Oliva points out in the chat, it may be just as well that Commodore didn't go in that direction. But Peddle had a vision of the future that wasn't crazy. But he did not believe in Jack's vision at all. He did not think a low-cost, crappy little computer was going to sell at this point. I need to talk a little bit about the organization of the company. Not super detailed, and I'm not going to be ever going super detailed into the organization of the company, but one thing that's important right now is at this point there is an east-west divide in Commodore. Jack is based in Palo Alto in California, where he has been based since 1968, even before Commodore International was a thing, when it was still a Canadian company. The systems engineers, Chuck Peddle's computer people, and also the calculator people are also in California. At this point, Chuck Peddle has been decentralizing them because Commodore also has a factory in California, and he'd found that when the factory was going, that people from the factory side would be going and bugging his engineers to fix problems on the line. There are engineers whose job it is to do that. They're called production engineers. But the problem was his R&D engineers were getting pulled in to do this stuff, and he felt like he needed to get them separated from the rest of the company to be able to just do R&D. So he had set up a couple of different satellite R&D operations, with the most important one being Moore Park, because that's where it was located. Still in Silicon Valley, not far away, but no longer in the same place as Jack and the factory and everything. These are the system engineers that were responsible for building new computers, new peripherals, new everything else, and new calculators as well, because Commodore is still at this point flailing along in the calculator business. Then they have Moss Technology, which is in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, way on the opposite side of the country. These people are technically chip people. They're there to be chip designers. But if they're engineers that know how chips work, they also know how computers work. They may not know all the best and most efficient ways to build a whole system, but if you squint, they can be systems engineers too. Peddle is leading what's essentially the computer division. I don't know if it was ever formalized as a computer division, but Peddle's leading the computer division in California. He's in California. The engineers are in California. Then Moss Technology, under Jerome Gwynn, is over in Pennsylvania, and he's got engineers working for him too, like Charpentier. Another engineer that's working there is a fresh graduate by the name of Bob Yanis. Bob Yanis not only joined Moss and Commodore, because it had been purchased by Commodore by this point, right out of college, but he had actually also gotten to know some of the people there when he was still in college in 1978. In 1978, he talked to Al Charpentier and learned about the VIC and actually was like, hey, can I have a VIC to do my senior project? So he did. He did his senior project using a VIC. He was also a humongous fan of electronic music and of synthesizers going back to the early 1970s. Fiddled around with building his own synthesizers as well, which may become important later, but is not quite important to the story just yet. So, completely independent of this managers meeting and Jack's pronouncement in London, because Yanis is not there. He's a young guy. He just joined the company in 79, right out of school. He's practically still an apprentice. Completely separate from that, Yanis is learning about the ZX80 and is incensed that it's getting a lot of good press when it is a really kind of crappy little computer. Sorry for any Sinclair fans out there. The ZX80 is what it is. He thought to himself, I can do a better computer than that using what we have right here at Moss Technology and using the VIC. So what he decides is, okay, they've been trying all along. We've been trying to create this 40-column VIC or 40-column VIC derivative for the engineers over on the West Coast in Moore Park. But what if 20 columns, 22 columns is enough? Why are we busting our butt on this? The ZX80 is getting all of this good press, and it doesn't have a display any better than that. Its main graphics mode is 24 by 32. It has a 64 by 48 mode as well, but, its main mode is 24 by 32. So what's it matter if this is only 20 columns? Let's just take a VIC, add the color generator to it, because the original VIC didn't have color, but they have a color generator chip, and vaguely put some other hardware around that, and we have a cheap computer that's going to be way better than the stupid ZX80. So he takes it upon himself in May to go ahead and put together the very most basic of prototypes. I mean, it's basically just a 6502, a VIC, and a color generator, and nothing else. They put together a case for it as well to make it presentable, but it doesn't actually have a disk operating system. It doesn't have BASIC and ROM. It doesn't have any hardware to connect to peripherals. It's not really a complete computer. He puts together a prototype just kind of proving that you could do a reasonable computer around a VIC that people might like. Completely oblivious, according to what he said, to Jack's new drive for this low-cost computer. But of course, his management, Jerome Gwynn, head of Moss, his management knows that Jack is looking for this. They encourage him. He does this little thing, and then when Jack's in town visiting, they present it to him. According to Bognall's book, Jack sees it and is basically like, that's great, ship it. And they're like, ship what? That, ship that. And they're like, but it's not a full computer. So then he's like, okay, fine. You have until June CES to make it one. This is in May.
That might be hard.
Yeah. So this flips everything on its head. And then to make matters worse, word of this gets back to the Moore Park researchers on the West Coast. They're like, what are they doing? They're chip designers. They're not system designers. You come into my house? This is what we do. Even though Chuck is still completely against this idea of a low-cost computer, he doesn't want the Moss people being the ones designing computers. So he tells his engineers, okay, now we've got to create a 20-column VIC-based computer too. So they create a prototype that's basically taking a VIC chip and adding it to a PET. It's slightly different from that, but they basically just take a PET and swap in a VIC chip or a VIC. They don't have the custom case and everything. Like, theirs is actually a real computer. It has BASIC and ROM. It can attach to peripherals. Like, it's actually a computer prototype. Giannis's is not, but Giannis had the case mold that he did and everything, and so it looked slicker. When presented with those two computers at CES, because they basically both worked hard to be ready to go to CES and both bought their thing to CES, Jack looked at him and was like, Giannis's, that's the one we're going to do. This is making Petal even more kind of annoyed with this whole situation. Because, like, he doesn't want to do this computer anyway. But if they're going to do this computer, he at least wants his people to be doing it, and he wants the basis of it to be a real computer and not this thing that is all smoke and mirrors. But Giannis's thing gets shown at CES. And then they do a quick process to start finishing the build of this thing. Of course, Giannis's system is not a full computer, so other people need to work on it. Scott Boulevard, the main office, there are still production engineers there, one of whom is Bob Russell. Bob Russell ends up taking on what Giannis has done and takes on the task of building a real computer out of it. He wants help from the Moore Park people, but Petal's like, we're not getting involved in this because this is stupid. So Petal's completely fed up, and he tells the Moore Park people not to help. In the end, a couple of them do end up helping because they kind of have to get this done. The final thing is actually more akin to the prototype built by the Moore Park people than the prototype built by Giannis. Though Giannis is still the one that kind of kicked the whole thing off by being like, let's just do a computer with 6502 and a VIC in the first place. So they get this thing mostly done by the end of July 1980, and then it's given over to Japan to do a final design. So they have a working prototype, but the actual layout of the boards and the design of the case and everything else is sent over to Japan. Because they do have a couple of engineers over there. It's primarily a place for sourcing parts, but they do have a couple of engineers over there as well. Jack also decides that they're going to release it in Japan first, not because he thinks it's going to do particularly well over there, but because he wants to release this low-cost computer in their backyard and show them, this is what's coming. Bow down before your cheap overlords. So they do. They call it the VIC 1001 over there, but it does release in Japan first before the end of 1980. Doesn't sell much over there. A lot of analysts at the time, though, gave it credit for delaying the Japanese, because everyone kind of thought the Japanese were about to introduce their first products worldwide, come to CES with stuff and whatnot. They didn't. Analysts at the time credited that to Commodore. I mean, whether that's true or not, we'd have to get into the archives of these computer companies and see what the people there were thinking. So who knows if it's actually true, but there's thought that maybe it did. Mission accomplished. They finish it up in Japan. They release it there first. They release it in the rest of the world in 1981. Commodore is still very strapped for cash at this point. They're still having all kinds of problems, but this would finally be the turning point. So the way that he gets this manufactured, because he still doesn't have the money to start up new lines, Gould is still refusing to let him sell stock, raise money in the markets, he finally says goodbye to the calculator business. The calculator business had taken a huge hit with the calculator wars. He tried to recover with a new scientific calculator project in 1979. With his whole vertical integration thing, he had a few things going on. There was an outside chip contractor called the Western Design Center, established by Bill Mensch, who had been one of Chuck Petal's 6502 designers and had left the company after that one to start out on his own. And so they established the Western Design Center as it was funded by Commodore, like it was 100% funded by Commodore, and their work was Ethan saying he was really the chief designer of 6502, and he was the layout guy. So he was the guy that, dictated where everything was going on that chip. Really talented guy. His loss was probably the biggest loss out of the early MOS people. But he kind of stayed connected to the company through this Western Design Center, which was fully funded by Jack and by Commodore, but had some autonomy for Mensch to kind of run his own shop because he kind of wanted to do it on his own. So he had them doing calculator chips. He bought an LCD company, an LCD manufacturer from the Japanese company Seiko, but that was located in the United States, I believe in Texas, and started Commodore Optoelectronics around this company so that he could make his own LCD displays for a calculator, something that was really not happening much in the US at this point. Then he bought another company called Frontier because he needed the CMOS process, which we talked about some in our RCA Studio 2 episode recently. He needed the CMOS process to create the chips because for these calculators, you needed a chip with low power consumption. Then it turned out that Frontier didn't actually have a working CMOS process, which derailed the whole project. He couldn't create a next-gen scientific calculator. He basically canned the calculator side of the business. He sued Psycho because they had bought it for shares. They got 100,000 shares of Commodore. That ended up being a really bad deal, and so he sued them and got half the shares back, figured out how to use some of that money saved from the calculator business to fund launching the VIC-20. They might have had some lingering calculator projects after that for a little bit, but that was basically the end of Commodore, the calculator company, which is the end of an era because they had been a calculator company at this point for over a decade. Real end of an era for Commodore there. But now they are firmly a computer company. They'll still occasionally do other things. They start up an electronic cash register project about this time that never goes anywhere too. But from this point forward, they are basically now a computer company. For the VIC-20 launch, they kind of know that this needs to be big. Jack knows that this needs to be big. He's not a guy that often trusts marketing folks, but he understands that if he is going to do a mass market computer, which is different from what he's attempted before, that he's going to need to treat it as a little more of a mass market product. That means having some of that support structure in place. So he ends up initially entrusting this whole thing to his personal assistant, Michael Tomczyk, who is young, scrappy, and hungry, but not very experienced. Vietnam vet, a little bit of marketing education, but hasn't really been tested in the field. Tomczyk becomes the marketing director for the computer, starts organizing materials like software and packaging and all of this stuff, ends up screwing the pooch because of his lack of experience. Does some stuff, particularly in the marketing and the advertisements that Jack doesn't like, and is the subject of an epic Jack attack. The Jack attack is one of the main features of Commodore under Jack Tramiel. Jack Tramiel was a very interesting person in a lot of ways. If he liked you, if you were in the family, you were safe. He might get mad at you. He might discipline you. He might send you out on a Japanese-style punishment tour and make you do something you absolutely hate for a while before you can come back into the fold. But you're safe. If you're not an inner family member, you can screw up to a degree. His standard was not perfection. But if you did something really good, he would praise you. He would make you feel important. Like, he wasn't all negativity. If you did something well, he would make you feel important. If you're an inner family member, he would give you huge bonuses, sometimes bonuses as much as 100% of your salary, like double your salary. But if you screwed up, he was going to let you know it. The letting you know it involved a lot of yelling and a lot of cutting remarks. If you took your Jack attack, as they came to be called, and acknowledged your mistake, and said, I understand what I did wrong. I will never, ever let this happen again. You could survive a Jack attack. If you made the same mistake again, you were probably gone, but you could survive a Jack attack. If you didn't do that, you were done. If you weren't an inner family member, you were fired. If you were an inner family member, he probably wouldn't fire you, but he would send you on a punishment tour. Michael Tomczyk didn't fully take his Jack attack well. He was not fired because he was an inner family member. Tramiel really appreciated him. So he ended up being replaced, and Jack brought in Kit Spencer, his UK marketing whiz, to launch the VIC-20 in the United States. Kit replicated the same playbook, essentially, that he used when launching the PET in the UK that made the PET so successful in that market. First of all, he took some of the packaging that they were using in Germany and the UK for the PET and kind of combined it and repurposed it to have a more attractive packaging for the VIC-20 in the US. Second, he went on and got as much software support as he could, aided in this by the fact that there was this little company called HAL Laboratory in Japan that had gotten close to Commodore Japan and was making great arcade perfect ports of games like Space Invaders, Galaxian, Rally X Head-On, and Pac-Man. Not that they could sell the Pac-Man in the United States. Really bumped up software support. Started a help desk so that if consumers had questions, they could call in and get them answered. And also decided, we all know this is a game machine. Let's treat it as one. Before that, it's like, well, it's a computer trainer. It's this and that. Computer companies were always about hiding the fact that they were first and foremost game machines. He didn't hide it. He's just like, this is a game machine, and we're going to tell people it's a game machine, and they're going to like it because the people want game machines. So Kit Spencer completely turned around the preparation and the marketing for the VIC-20 computer. They take it to CES in June 1981. They get orders and everything. Then, in the fall of 1981, as we talked about in our Home Computer Price Wars episode, so we don't need to belabor the point here, they get the computer into Kmart.
Kmart?
Computers like this had not been in mass market retailers before because computers needed dedicated service and support. Computers were something new. They were something foreign. They were something complicated. You needed to go into specialty stores or at the most department stores. Atari was in Sears, but even in department stores, you have dedicated departments, you have dedicated staff that can help you understand, choose between the options, etc. Stores like Kmart have staff as well, discount stores, but the turnover is so high because these are minimum wage and not particularly great jobs, and so there's lots of turnover. You don't retain employees. So even if you trained an employee or two in the computer, they'd be gone maybe within 6 months, and then you're back to square one and they're not going to sell. We talked about this in the home computer episode, but Kit Spencer actually promised to train every single associate at every single Kmart on the computer. That was the way they got in the store. Most of those guys were probably gone in 6 months. Long term, it probably didn't matter. But psychologically, it convinced Kmart to take the system. So they got it into Kmart, which could then sell it at a cheaper price, which began the process of Commodore undercutting its dealers and making them upset.
That's not going to go anywhere.
Which would maybe come back to haunt the company. Maybe come back and haunt the company later. Then, once they got into Kmart, other stores of a similar ilk, the Walmarts and the Toys R Us's of the world, started to follow and said that they would take it as well. Then and only then, after they got into mass market retail, did they start a series of television commercials, the first time Commodore's done this to support a computer, which started airing in March 1982. Of course, were headlined by William Shatner, because nothing said the future is here and computers are here like Star Trek, and Leonard Nimoy was too expensive. As we talked about in our Home Computer Price Wars episode, Shatner was only just now at the same time that they were filming the commercials. He was filming Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. He was only just about to get TJ Hooker on the air. He was very quickly going to become a lot more popular again and a lot more expensive, but they caught him at his nadir when he hadn't really had much going for him on television after the original Star Trek went off the air. He was still busy. He was doing theater and other stuff, but he just wasn't the same level of celebrity in this time period. So they launched the VIC-20.
Woohoo!
And it's a huge success. We're going to not go into super detail because we have our Home Computer Price Wars episode that's a companion to this. You can listen to that to learn all about the ins and outs of how the VIC-20 did and how its price went over time. But basically, it did successfully establish this new market for low-cost game computers. They focused on competing with the video game industry rather than competing with the computer industry, and as a result, they became the first model of microcomputer to sell over 1 million units in 1982. Huge success. Commodore stock finally starts to take off a little bit. Everyone's happy. So where do you go from there?
Up.
Well, at this point, Jack kind of thought they'd done the computers for the masses, not the classes thing. So at this point, he was content to go back to trying to take the upper end of the market again and do an Apple killer, or even at this point, an IBM PC killer. It was too late for Chuck Peddle. Chuck Peddle was already gone. He was very dissatisfied at the way things went with the VIC in 1980. Jack was very unhappy with him because he basically kept working on the toy when Jack told him that's no longer the company focus. So he was sent on a punishment tour. He was in her family. He wasn't going to be fired. But at this time, at the same time, Jack decided he was done with California. He wanted to consolidate the majority of the company in Pennsylvania because he didn't want to pay California taxes anymore. So if he was going to consolidate in one place, he'd rather consolidate in Pennsylvania. So he started the process of moving the company to Pennsylvania. Told Chuck that it would be his job to coordinate the move. Chuck didn't want to do that. He was not the only one fed up with the direction of the company. A former president of the company, Chris Fish, was also upset. He also reconnected with John Pavinin from the Moss days. He was no longer part of Commodore, but, obviously they still knew each other. So he decided to leave with the two of them and pursue his dreams for higher quality graphical computers at a new company called Sirius Systems. So it was too late for Chuck. Chuck was gone. But they did start to look at that higher end of the market again and started working on two computers called the P128 and the B256. P for personal, B for business. The numbers was the amount of RAM they were both going to have. The P128 was going to be kind of in the vein of the Apple killer again. They were finally getting to the point where they had a proper graphics chip, so it was going to use that. Then the B256 was going to be full business machine trying to take the high end of the market where IBM was finally starting to try to establish itself with the PC. He figured he'd done his computer for the masses. Meanwhile, back at Moss Technology, just like Giannis had gotten uppity in creating that VIC-20, Charpentier is about to get uppity again because he is looking at the video game market. And he is seeing an opportunity to really attack that market in a way that the VIC couldn't. The VIC could compete with that market on price, but what it didn't really have was sprites. The newer video game and low-end home computers, like the Intellivision and the TI-99 4A, were really focusing on upping the sprite game. Charpentier got to thinking, now is the time to make a proper 40-column video chip. They had tried this craziness with kind of fusing together two VICs to make a 40-column display thing. It didn't work. They were in a hurry. Now he's like, let's start over from scratch. Let's not try to tie this new chip into anything that's been done on the previous VIC. Let's create a new chip from scratch that uses DRAM and does 40 columns properly. And let's make it a sprite mover because we're going to make this a video game chip. So he creates what they end up calling the VIC-40 that is a really good sprite mover. The Intellivision and the TI-99-4 were the main influences on the chip design, according to Charpentier and Bagnall's book. At the same time, Giannis, as I had said before, is really interested in synthesizers, always has been. So he decides to design an amazing sound chip, the SID. Even though at first they were thinking about these as video game chips, once they had them done, they were like, well, shoot, the VIC-20 is doing really well. Let's create an update to the VIC-20. Call it the VIC-40, put 16K of RAM in it, put a VIC-2 and a SID in there, and have this cool sprite machine that, plays games even better than the VIC does and can compete with things like the TI-99 4A. They present that in the fall of 1981 to Jack. When Jack sees that, he's like, yes, even though he's got them back on this higher level computer thing, that doesn't mean he doesn't have time for a good idea. He sees this and he says, yes, 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 let's do that. Except for one thing, memory prices are coming down right now. I think by the time we have this ready, we can go to 64K and we will leave all of these other companies in the dust. So he actually mandated that they go with a full 64K, which I believe is the maximum addressable by a 6502 without doing fancy switching stuff. So just like that, the concept of the Commodore 64 is born. Of course, they were calling it the VIC-40 as they were developing it, but since they have the P128, personal computer, 128K, they had the B256, business computer, 256K. So they decided to designate the VIC-40 the C64, consumer computer 64K. Though, of course, it goes down in history as the Commodore 64. It's technically the C64, but the people call it the Commodore 64. Once again, Kit Spencer is in charge of the launch. Once again, Kit Spencer makes it a huge success. He does many of the same things. He sources lots of software. He launched a new magazine. He didn't launch a new magazine for the VIC-20, but they already had a magazine in the US, so there was a magazine at the time. He just didn't launch a new one. For the Commodore 64, he wanted to launch a magazine that was more focused on games. So he launched a new one that was originally called Power/Play. They upped the ante. So the VIC was positioned as a game machine. For this one, what Kit Spencer wanted to do was say, this is a real computer that gives you great power for the price. And by the way, it can also play great games. So they do another round of commercials. They decide not to go with the celebrity approach. Shatner's contract is up. They don't renew it. They don't want to go with the personality approach. They really want to focus on the computer. They hire a boutique ad agency in New York, Ali and Gargano. They come up with a series of commercials narrated by Henry Morgan, an old radio personality that was also known to television audiences for the old game show What's My Line, that focused on the amount of memory, the 64K, in the computer, and the great price that you got it for. And they also made targeted ads. Some of these ads specifically targeted Apple, specifically targeted IBM, to show that this was a superior computer. They actually didn't hype the graphical capabilities or the game capabilities at all. But by word of mouth, it became obvious that they were also great graphical computers. So once again, Kit Spencer coming in. This is about the only time that Commodore in the US had an effective marketer, which is why this is the one time with the VIC-20 and the C64 where the computers were doing just as well in the United States as they were doing around the world, because Kit Spencer understood the way you support a product with software, with a clear marketing message that's going to resonate with people, and with aftermarket support, whether that be magazines or help desks or whatever else. So Commodore has another hit on its hands. We won't go into the price war because we really do cover this part of Commodore in the home computer price wars. Like, we get very detailed on what's going on when with these computers in the marketplace and how well they're doing.
We have another whole live stream and 3 episodes about that.
Exactly. But suffice it to say, the Commodore 64 sells like hotcakes. Releases in 82. It really picks up in sales in 83 as the price comes down due to the price wars. The VIC-20 continues to sell well in the early part of this period as well, 82 and 83. By the end of 83, Commodore can celebrate itself reaching $1 billion in sales. The stock has run. It's insane. Irving Gould's happy because of that. Company's doing well. It's found its niche. Still having a little bit of trouble in that upper end. The P128 ends up being canceled in 83 because who needs it when there's a Commodore 64? They do release the B256 under the name CBM2. It kind of doesn't do all of that great because IBM is kind of taking over. It does a little better in Europe because they care more in Europe. In fact, it might have only been released in Europe. But it really doesn't do that great. Commodore is now on the top of the world. They're ready to take on the world. They start several new projects. The Sinclair computers are coming. The ZX81 is coming to the United States as the Timex Sinclair 1000, or it has come to the United States. And they're going to follow up with the ZX Spectrum as the Timex Sinclair 2000. Before the price wars get too carried away with the VIC-20 plunging in price, they decide that they are going to create a Sinclair killer, a more primitive system codenamed TED that will not have sprite generating capability and not have quite as good a sound as the Commodore 64, but will still have colorful graphics and will be able to retail for a low price. They decide that they are going to start figuring out what the next step is after the Commodore 64 in terms of keeping that part of the market going. They're going to look into portable computers, going to look into an Osborne killer. Turns out you don't need to kill something that decides to commit suicide, but they're looking into a portable C64. They still have the LCD company, the display manufacturer. They're going to return to trying to kill IBM and take out Sun Microsystems just for the heck of it on the way by starting a Unix-based high-end workstation, the C900. They have all of these irons in the fire. Some started in 83, some started in 84. But of course, just at this point of greatest triumph, billion in sales, taking over the market, destroying the competition, as we talk about in the price war episodes, an epic fallout occurs between Jack Tramiel and Irving Gould that will set the future course of the company and chart its path to ruin. That is where we will take up the story in episode 3 of the History of Commodore.
It gets more and more crazy, and I still remember my Commodore 64 as that light pen.
Indeed.
So yes, kids, we will see you next time on They Create Worlds, where we get to see, will this end with episode 3, or will we go on to 4? Next time on They Create Worlds. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have links to some of the things that we discussed in this and other episode. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. If you do sign up, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting service that you use. We now have the podcast available on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license.
I still maintain that we're not going to go past 3 in the live stream. I think we're going to do 4 on Commodore, but quite honestly, just the amount of time it takes to do 3 is a very long time. 4 is a lot, but also I hadn't quite gotten all of my in-depth research done on the last couple of years of the company, which if this had been a 3-part episode would have been fine because we could have glossed over some of that. But if it's going to be 4 parts, I need to have that more solid. All joking aside, we are definitely only going to live stream 3 episodes, but there will clearly need to be a 4th episode to finish the entire thing.